Everyone in the precinct smiled the moment the new officer walked through the doors. She was quiet, compact, and calm in a way that made people underestimate her instantly. Within her first hour, a few of the older officers had already decided she was an easy target for their jokes. By the end of the week, they had gone further, daring her to step onto the mats in the training room, just for laughs, just to see what she would do. None of them knew that long before she ever wore a badge, she had spent more than 2 decades behind a sprink, mastering combat, discipline, and control. What happened next silenced the entire building in less than 3 minutes. The city precinct had seen dozens of new transfers over the years, but few arrivals drew as many stares as the woman who walked in that gray Tuesday morning carrying a single duffel bag and a folder of paperwork. She introduced herself simply, without embellishment, as Officer Maya Brooks, 34 years old, newly assigned to patrol. Her uniform was pressed with military precision, her posture upright, her expression unreadable. She did not smile too much, and she did not explain herself, which some of the veteran officers mistook for arrogance rather than discipline. Derek Collins noticed her before anyone else did. At 38, he had spent over a decade in that precinct and had appointed himself, unofficially, as the man who tested every rookie who walked through the door. He leaned against the wall near the intake desk, arms crossed, watching Maya sign her transfer documents with a steady hand. He waited until she looked up before speaking, his voice pitched just loud enough for the room to hear him clearly. "Don't tell me you used to be a model or something," he said, letting a slow grin spread across his face. A few officers nearby chuckled, and Tyler Ross, 29 years old and eager to be liked by anyone louder than himself, laughed the hardest of all. Maya glanced at Derek for exactly 1 second, then returned her attention to the paperwork in front of her, finishing her signature without a single change in her expression. She did not answer the joke, and the silence that followed it felt heavier than any comeback could have been. Sergeant Helen Grant, 50 years old and known throughout the department for missing nothing, stood near her office doorway with a mug of coffee in hand. She watched the exchange without interrupting, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the new officer's reaction, or rather, the absence of one. Grant had trained enough recruits over the years to recognize the difference between someone who stayed quiet out of fear and someone who stayed quiet out of choice. Maya's silence belonged unmistakably to the second category, and Grant filed that observation away for later. By midday, Maya had completed every piece of onboarding paperwork, toured the building, and been assigned a locker at the far end of the changing room, conveniently distant from the lockers used by the rest of the unit. She said nothing about the placement, hanging her jacket with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else. Word had already begun to spread through the precinct that the new transfer was unusually calm, almost detached, and more than one officer whispered that her composure would not survive the first real test that Derek and his friends were famous for administering. That test came just before the end of the shift, when Derek approached her near the equipment room with 2 other officers trailing behind him like an audience waiting for a show to begin. He told her, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once lost this particular game, that everyone in the unit proved themselves eventually, one way or another, and that the training room downstairs was where the real introductions happened. Maya listened without interrupting, her arms loose at her sides, her face calm enough to almost look bored. When he finished, she said only that she looked forward to earning her place the same way everyone else had, and walked toward the locker room without waiting for a reply. "Come by the gym this afternoon," Derek called after her, his voice carrying down the hallway. "Let us see what you're really made of." A few heads turned. Tyler smirked and nudged the officer beside him, already imagining how the afternoon might unfold. Maya did not turn around, did not slow her pace, and did not offer any indication that the invitation had registered as anything more than background noise. But somewhere behind that composed expression, a memory stirred, one built across 22 years of mats, mentors, tournaments, and countless hours most people in that building could never imagine enduring. The days that followed made it clear that Maya's arrival had not been forgotten so easily. She was assigned the least desirable patrol routes, the paperwork nobody wanted, and the overnight shifts that wore down even veteran officers within a few months. When she requested backup during a routine traffic stop, the response came late enough to make the delay feel deliberate rather than accidental. She never filed a complaint, never raised her voice about it, and never let her performance slip despite the mounting pressure stacked quietly against her. In the break room, a betting pool had quietly formed, one that several officers pretended not to know about whenever a supervisor walked past. The wager was simple: How many weeks would the new transfer last before she requested a reassignment or resigned altogether? Numbers were scrawled on a folded piece of paper tucked behind the coffee machine, and Tyler had apparently claimed the shortest timeline, betting that she would not survive past the 1-month mark. Derek, more confident than anyone, had bet she would break even sooner, certain that his own methods of pressure would prove decisive. Maya never once gave any indication that she was aware of the pool, though there was little in that building she failed to notice. She completed her assignments with the same unshaken calm she had shown on her first day, filing reports with precise handwriting and responding to every provocation with a patience that unsettled the people trying to provoke her. A handful of younger officers began watching her with quiet curiosity rather than mockery, unable to understand how someone could absorb so much friction without ever cracking under the weight of it. Derek, growing more frustrated by her composure than he cared to admit, began escalating the small cruelties into something closer to open hostility. He mocked her patrol reports in front of others, questioned her judgment during briefings, and made pointed comments about department diversity hires whenever supervisors were out of earshot. Tyler, always eager to align himself with whoever held more perceived power in the room, echoed every comment with a laugh that never quite reached his eyes. Maya absorbed each remark the way water absorbs stone, without visible damage, without retaliation, and without the satisfaction Derek seemed desperate to extract from her. One afternoon, as officers filed out of the briefing room, Tyler deliberately shoved his shoulder into Maya's as he passed, hard enough to make her stumble half a step. A few officers nearby went quiet, waiting to see what would happen, some hoping for an explosion they could gossip about later. Maya straightened her jacket, looked at him evenly, and said only that if he wanted a real confrontation, he should choose a more appropriate moment for it. Her tone carried no anger, only a kind of patient warning that made Tyler's smirk falter for just a second before he forced it back into place. Sergeant Grant, watching from the hallway with her arms crossed, said nothing in that moment either, though her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had built her career on knowing when to intervene and when to let a situation reveal its own truth, and something told her that this particular situation was still building toward something the department would remember for a long time. She returned to her office, pulled Maya's personnel file from a locked drawer, and studied it once again, this time lingering on a section she had skimmed too quickly during the initial transfer review. That evening, after most of the unit had gone home, Grant remained behind, reading through commendation letters and training certifications that had somehow been filed without ever being discussed during Maya's onboarding. She noted references to advanced instructor credentials, a list of competitions that spanned more than a decade, and a recommendation letter written by a police academy director who described Maya as one of the most disciplined recruits he had ever supervised. None of it had been mentioned casually in the hallway, none of it worn as a badge of honor, and Grant found herself increasingly troubled by how easily the department had overlooked what was sitting plainly in front of them. She closed the folder slowly, deciding to say nothing yet, choosing instead to watch how the situation continued to unfold before intervening. Meanwhile, whispers about the upcoming challenge in the training room had already reached nearly every corner of the precinct, carried through hallway conversations and quiet exchanges near the coffee machine. Some officers argued that Derek had finally gone too far, worried that provoking a physical confrontation with a fellow officer crossed a line that jokes alone had not. Others seemed almost eager for the spectacle, treating the rumor with the same casual excitement reserved for football pools or holiday parties. Maya, aware of the growing attention despite never acknowledging it directly, continued her patrol duties with unwavering focus, refusing to let the anticipation building around her change anything about how she carried herself. By the time Friday arrived, the tension inside the precinct had become impossible to ignore, humming beneath every interaction like static before a storm. Officers who normally kept to themselves found reasons to linger near the training room after their shifts ended, sensing that something was about to happen whether anyone planned it or not. Derek had spent the entire week building toward this moment, dropping hints in the break room, promising anyone who would listen that today would finally answer the question everyone had been quietly asking about the new transfer. The training room, usually reserved for defensive tactics drills and occasional sparring sessions, filled with more bodies than it had seen in months. Officers leaned against padded walls, sat on stacked mats, and clustered near the doorway, their voices overlapping in a low murmur of anticipation. Derek stood near the center of the room, rolling his shoulders with theatrical confidence, clearly enjoying the audience he had assembled. Tyler stood beside him, phone already raised, eager to capture whatever was about to unfold for reasons that had little to do with department training records. When Maya entered, still in her uniform, the room quieted just enough for Derek's voice to carry clearly across the space. "Let's go a few rounds, just for fun," he said, spreading his hands as though offering a friendly gesture rather than a challenge. Laughter rippled through the onlookers, some genuine, some nervous, none of it particularly kind. Maya studied the room for a long moment, taking in the phones raised in her direction, the smirks, the anticipation dressed up as camaraderie, and she declined without raising her voice, stating plainly that this was not how she preferred to spend her evenings. Derek pressed harder, needling her with comments about fear, about excuses, about whether she had the nerve to back up everything her calm exterior seemed to be hiding. Tyler kept his phone steady, narrating quietly to whoever might watch the footage later, describing the moment as though it were already historic. A few officers began chanting encouragement, not entirely sure whether they wanted to see Maya humiliated or simply wanted to see something happen after a long, uneventful week. The pressure in the room built steadily, thick enough that even the officers uninvolved in the taunting began shifting uncomfortably where they stood. Finally, Maya spoke, her voice even but carrying an edge that had not been present in any of her previous interactions with Derek. "If this is how the department chooses to welcome new colleagues, then fine," she said, letting the words settle over the room before continuing. She reached up and unclasped her watch, sliding it into her jacket pocket with unhurried precision, and the simple gesture changed the entire atmosphere of the room instantly. Laughter died away. Phones lowered slightly, then rose again with renewed interest. Even Derek's grin faltered for a fraction of a second before he masked it with bravado. Sergeant Grant appeared in the doorway just as Maya stepped onto the mat, her expression unreadable, her posture rigid with the tension of a woman deciding whether to intervene or allow the moment to play out. She had seen enough locker room disputes over the years to know most of them ended in bruised egos rather than bruised bodies, but something about the stillness in Maya's movements told her this particular confrontation might not follow the usual script. She stayed silent, arms crossed, positioned close enough to step in if things went too far, but far enough to let the truth reveal itself first. Derek moved first, lunging forward with the kind of confidence built on years of assuming his size and aggression would always be enough to end a confrontation quickly. Maya simply stepped aside, her movement small and economical, avoiding his charge without any wasted motion. She did not strike back, did not retaliate, and did not attempt to embarrass him further than his own momentum already had. The onlookers murmured in surprise, some expecting an immediate takedown, others assuming she was simply too intimidated to fight back at all. Derek recovered quickly, embarrassed by the miss, and came at her again with more force, swinging wide in frustration rather than technique. Maya slipped the strike easily, her feet shifting in small, deliberate steps that seemed almost lazy to the untrained eye, but were, in reality, precisely calculated. She still did not counter, still did not press an advantage, and her restraint began to unsettle the room far more than aggression would have. A few officers who had laughed loudest earlier now watched in confused silence, sensing that something about this exchange did not match the outcome they had expected. By the fourth attempt, sweat had begun to bead across Derek's forehead, his breathing louder, his frustration bleeding into every wasted swing. Maya moved like water, finding the path of least resistance, never in the wrong place, never a half-second late, never expending more energy than the moment required. One of the younger officers standing near the back of the room leaned toward a colleague and whispered, low enough that only a few people caught it, wondering aloud where on earth she had learned to move like that. Sergeant Grant's eyes flicked toward the whisper, then back to Maya, her earlier suspicion sharpening into something closer to certainty. Some of the onlookers began shifting their weight nervously, sensing that the entertainment they had gathered to enjoy was quickly becoming something far more serious than a light-hearted hazing ritual. A few of the younger recruits who had laughed loudest at the earlier jokes now watched with a mixture of awe and unease, unable to look away from the precision with which Maya avoided every attack without ever seeming to try particularly hard. Tyler's phone remained raised, though his hand had grown noticeably unsteady. The footage he had hoped would humiliate a colleague slowly transforming into something closer to evidence of his friend's mounting embarrassment. Even the officers who had wagered on how quickly Maya would break began quietly recalculating their expectations, the betting pool behind the coffee machine suddenly feeling like a foolish and short-sighted idea. Derek, refusing to accept that his repeated attempts were failing purely due to skill rather than luck, planted his feet and squared his shoulders for what he clearly intended to be his most forceful strike yet. The room seemed to hold its breath collectively, sensing that whatever happened next would either restore his reputation entirely or end it decisively in front of everyone who mattered to him professionally. Maya's expression remained unchanged, calm and focused, the same composed stillness she had carried since the very first moment she stepped onto the mat. She waited, patient and unhurried, for the exact instant his momentum committed fully in one direction, refusing to move a fraction of a second too early or too late. Derek's next attack came with everything he had, a wide, committed strike meant to finally end the standoff and restore the reputation he had spent the entire week building toward this outcome. Maya caught his wrist mid-motion, redirected his own momentum against him, and applied a simple joint lock that folded him toward the mat before he even understood what had happened. He hit the ground hard, more from surprise than pain, his arm still trapped, his face pressed against the padded floor, while the room around him fell utterly silent. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody raised a phone higher for a better angle. The only sound was Derek's ragged breathing and the soft creak of mats beneath shifting feet. Tyler, panicking at the sudden reversal and desperate to salvage whatever remained of the moment, lunged toward Maya without any real plan beyond simply not standing still while his friend lay pinned to the floor. She released Derek smoothly, turned with barely any wasted motion, and redirected Tyler's momentum in a way that left him disoriented and off balance within a single second. He stumbled, overcorrected, and found himself controlled just as easily as Derek had been, his arms secured, his body angled in a position that made further movement pointless. The entire exchange, from Derek's first strike to Tyler's collapse, had taken less than 3 minutes, and not a single person had been seriously hurt. The silence that followed stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable, broken finally by a low murmur that spread through the crowd like a current finding its way through still water. Officers exchanged glances, some stunned, some embarrassed on Derek's behalf, a few quietly impressed in a way they had not expected to feel toward the woman they had spent an entire week trying to break down. Sergeant Grant stepped further into the room, her expression carefully neutral, though something in her posture suggested she had just confirmed exactly what she suspected all along. She said nothing yet, choosing instead to watch how the room settled before deciding her next move. A training instructor who had wandered in partway through the confrontation, drawn by the unusual crowd gathered outside the gym, stepped forward and studied Maya with open curiosity rather than judgment. He had spent enough years around combative sports to recognize technique when he saw it, and what he had just witnessed was not luck or improvisation but the product of serious, sustained instruction. He asked her plainly where she had trained, his tone carrying genuine respect rather than the mockery that had filled the room only minutes earlier. Maya answered simply, her breathing barely elevated despite the exchange, stating only that she had trained for 22 years. The number alone was enough to shift the atmosphere in the room from stunned silence into quiet disbelief, several officers repeating it under their breath as though hearing it again might make it easier to comprehend. Derek, still recovering on the mat, pushed himself upright slowly, his pride visibly bruised in a way his body was not. Tyler sat nearby, rubbing his shoulder, avoiding eye contact with everyone around him. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. Sergeant Grant crossed her arms and allowed herself a small, knowing exhale, the kind reserved for confirmation of a suspicion held for longer than anyone in the room realized. Word of what had happened in the training room spread through the precinct with unusual speed, carried in hushed conversations between officers who had witnessed it firsthand and repeated in exaggerated detail to those who had missed it entirely. By the following morning, Maya found herself the subject of curious glances rather than mocking ones, though she carried herself with the same unaffected calm she had shown since her very first day. She did not bring up the incident, did not gloat, and did not treat anyone differently despite the abrupt shift in how they now treated her. Her quiet consistency, more than the fight itself, seemed to unsettle people the most. During a shift change later that week, a small group of officers gathered near the break room, their curiosity finally outweighing their earlier hostility enough to ask Maya directly about her background. She answered without embellishment, describing a childhood spent in structured training halls, years of competing in national tournaments, and a series of black belts earned across multiple disciplines through relentless, unglamorous repetition. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had once trained law enforcement officers in de-escalation and control techniques, work she found more meaningful than any tournament trophy she had collected along the way. She made it clear she had never sought recognition for any of it, preferring instead to simply be a competent, reliable officer among her peers. Sergeant Grant, listening from a short distance away, finally spoke up, admitting to the group that Maya's personnel file had included commendations and training credentials she herself had underestimated during the initial review. "Now I understand exactly what kind of officer we brought into this unit," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone reassessing a judgment she wished she had made earlier. Several officers shifted uncomfortably, aware that their earlier treatment of Maya now looked far worse in light of everything being revealed. Derek, standing near the doorway, said nothing, his usual confidence nowhere to be found as the reality of the situation settled over him. One of the younger officers, curious rather than accusatory, asked Maya why she had never mentioned any of it during her first week, especially given how relentlessly she had been tested by her new colleagues. Maya considered the question for a moment before answering honestly, explaining that titles and trophies had never been the reason she chose this profession in the first place. She had learned early in her training, she said, that the officers who leaned hardest on their reputations were often the ones least prepared for situations where reputation meant nothing at all. What mattered to her, she explained, was whether she could keep people safe when it counted, not whether anyone respected her resume beforehand. She went on to describe, briefly and without any dramatic flourish, the years spent training under instructors who demanded discipline long before they ever taught technique, the early mornings, the repeated failures, the slow accumulation of skill built one unremarkable session at a time. She mentioned competing nationally in her 20s, earning recognition in multiple disciplines, and later choosing to teach de-escalation and control tactics to officers who often arrived skeptical of anyone without a badge instructing them. It was rewarding work, she admitted, but it had also shown her how easily people mistook calm behavior for weakness, an assumption she had encountered more times than she could count throughout her career. By the time she finished speaking, the room had grown noticeably quieter, several officers reconsidering everything they thought they understood about the woman standing in front of them. The uneasy quiet that followed Maya's revelations did not last long, interrupted abruptly by an emergency call that tore through the precinct with the kind of urgency that reminded everyone why they had chosen this profession in the first place. Dispatch reported an armed suspect holding a hostage inside a downtown convenience store, a man reportedly unstable, armed with a knife, and unwilling to negotiate through the usual channels. Officers scrambled for their gear, adrenaline replacing the earlier tension entirely. The training room confrontation suddenly feeling irrelevant compared to the danger. Sergeant Grant barked assignments quickly, her voice sharp with the discipline of someone who had handled crises before and knew exactly how little time they had. Derek, normally eager to prove himself in high-pressure situations, hesitated as he approached his vehicle, his earlier bravado nowhere in sight, now that the stakes had shifted from ego to genuine danger. Tyler's hands trembled slightly as he checked his equipment, his face pale, his usual bluster replaced by visible anxiety he could not entirely hide. Maya, by contrast, moved with the same measured calm she had shown all week, checking her gear methodically, her expression settling into the focused stillness of someone who had trained specifically for moments like this one. When Sergeant Grant called for a volunteer to take point in de-escalating the situation, Maya stepped forward without hesitation, her voice steady as she confirmed she was ready. As the convoy of patrol vehicles pulled out of the precinct lot, sirens cutting through the afternoon air, several officers found themselves glancing toward Maya's car with a mixture of curiosity and quiet reassurance they had not expected to feel only days earlier. The mockery of the previous week suddenly felt distant, replaced by an unspoken recognition that the woman they had doubted might be exactly the person needed for a situation like this one. Sergeant Grant, riding just ahead, reviewed the limited details available over the radio, noting that negotiators had already attempted contact without success and that the suspect's mental state appeared increasingly unstable. She requested updates every few minutes, her voice clipped and professional, aware that every second mattered once a situation reached this level of volatility. The drive across town felt longer than it actually was, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on everyone inside the vehicles, despite the practiced calm most officers maintained outwardly. Radio chatter indicated that additional units had already established a perimeter, that store patrons had been evacuated except for the one clerk still trapped inside, and that the suspect had grown increasingly agitated each time officers attempted to approach the entrance. Maya listened closely to every update, her mind already working through possible approaches, weighing the risks of each option against the singular goal of ensuring nobody inside that store was harmed. By the time they arrived, the scene matched the tension conveyed over the radio almost exactly, confirming that whatever happened next would require every ounce of composure she had spent decades building. The scene outside the convenience store was chaotic when they arrived. Officers positioned behind vehicles, a small crowd held back by hastily strung barrier tape, and flashing lights casting sharp red and blue shadows across the storefront windows. Inside, visible through the glass, the suspect paced near the counter, knife gripped tightly, a terrified store clerk pressed against the register with nowhere to run. Negotiators attempted contact through a bullhorn, their voices met with erratic shouting from inside, the situation deteriorating with every passing minute. Sergeant Grant turned to Maya, asking quietly whether she believed she could approach the situation without escalating it further, and Maya answered simply that she intended to try. She approached the storefront slowly, her hands visible, her posture deliberately non-threatening despite the tension coiled beneath her calm exterior. She spoke through the open doorway in a measured, unhurried tone, acknowledging the suspect's fear rather than his aggression, offering no threats, no sudden movements, nothing that might trigger a violent reaction. The suspect's shouting slowly softened into uneven, ragged breathing, his grip on the knife loosening slightly as Maya continued speaking, her words focused entirely on de-escalation rather than confrontation. Behind the barrier, officers watched in tense silence, some holding their breath, none quite believing how effectively she seemed to be diffusing a situation that had felt unsalvageable only minutes earlier. When the moment finally came, it happened almost too quickly to process, the suspect lunging suddenly toward the clerk in a final, desperate act of panic rather than calculated violence. Maya moved instantly, closing the distance with practiced efficiency, redirecting the knife hand safely away from the clerk while securing the suspect's arm in a controlled lock that ended the threat within seconds. The knife clattered to the floor. The suspect collapsed to his knees, sobbing rather than struggling, the fight draining out of him the moment he realized resistance was futile. Nobody was hurt. The hostage stumbled free, shaking but unharmed, and the entire sequence, captured on multiple cameras from multiple angles, had taken barely any time at all. The officers who had gathered outside erupted into a strange mixture of relief and stunned silence as the suspect was secured and the hostage guided to safety. Sergeant Grant exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders finally releasing as she watched Maya calmly hand off the restrained suspect to responding units without a hint of triumph in her expression. Derek, standing near the barrier, stared at the scene with an expression somewhere between disbelief and shame, the memory of his earlier mockery suddenly feeling unbearably small compared to what he had just witnessed. Tyler said nothing at all, his phone still in his pocket for the first time in days, apparently unwilling to reduce this moment to footage the way he had tried to do with the training room confrontation. The clerk, still trembling from the ordeal, was guided toward a waiting ambulance for evaluation, repeating over and over that the officer who approached the suspect had somehow made him feel safer with every word she spoke. A paramedic wrapped a blanket around his shoulders while he described, in halting sentences, how certain he had been that the situation would end in tragedy, and how astonished he remained that it had not. Nearby, a small crowd of bystanders who had gathered behind the barrier tape began speaking quietly among themselves, several of them recording brief statements for local reporters who had already begun arriving at the scene. None of the attention seemed to register with Maya, who remained focused on completing the necessary paperwork and confirming that every procedure had been followed correctly before allowing herself even a moment to acknowledge what had just occurred. Sergeant Grant approached her quietly once the scene had been fully secured, studying her for a long moment before speaking. She admitted, in a voice softer than her usual clipped tone, that she had suspected something like this was possible from the very first day Maya walked through the precinct doors. Maya only nodded, saying that she preferred to let her actions speak for themselves rather than her history, and that today had simply been another day of doing the job she had trained her entire life to do well. Grant said nothing further, though the respect in her expression was unmistakable as they turned back toward the vehicles together. By the time everyone returned to the precinct, footage of the hostage situation had already reached Captain Robert Hayes, 56 years old and known throughout the department for his measured, no-nonsense leadership. He reviewed the recordings personally in his office, watching the entire sequence multiple times, his expression shifting from concern to quiet admiration as Maya's handling of the crisis became increasingly clear. He called for a full unit briefing that afternoon, an unusual request that immediately signaled to everyone gathered that something significant was about to be addressed. Officers filed into the briefing room with a mixture of curiosity and unease, uncertain exactly what direction the conversation would take. Captain Hayes stood at the front of the room, arms folded, his gaze sweeping over the assembled officers before he began speaking, his tone deliberate and measured. He informed the unit that Maya Brooks had previously served as a tactical training instructor for multiple law enforcement agencies, her expertise sought after by departments far larger than their own. He explained that her personnel record placed her among the most highly regarded officers in the entire regional network, despite her deliberate choice to request standard patrol duty rather than a specialized position. The room grew quieter with every sentence, the weight of the revelation settling over officers who had spent the past week treating her with careless disrespect. "You mocked the most capable officer in this room," Captain Hayes said finally, his voice carrying no anger, only a firm, unmistakable disappointment that landed harder than any raised voice could have. Derek lowered his head, unable to meet the captain's gaze, his earlier confidence replaced entirely by quiet shame. Tyler, sitting near the back of the room, discreetly deleted the mocking footage from his phone, the recording that once felt like leverage now feeling like evidence of his own poor judgment. Nobody spoke as Captain Hayes concluded the briefing, the silence in the room saying more than any words could have managed. In the days that followed, the atmosphere inside the precinct shifted noticeably, the earlier hostility replaced by a cautious, evolving respect that no one rushed to articulate directly. Derek approached Maya privately near the end of a shift, his usual bravado absent entirely, and offered an apology that, while imperfect, carried genuine weight behind it. Maya accepted his apology without dramatics, her tone calm and free of any lingering resentment, stating simply that everyone deserved the chance to reconsider their behavior. She made no attempt to embarrass him further, offering no lecture, no gloating, nothing beyond quiet acknowledgement that the matter was settled. Sergeant Grant, recognizing an opportunity too valuable to overlook, approached Maya soon after with a proposal that had clearly been forming in her mind since the hostage situation had unfolded. She asked whether Maya would be willing to lead a defensive tactics and control training program for the entire unit, given her extensive background and evident skill in de-escalation under pressure. Maya considered the request carefully before agreeing, stating that she believed every officer benefited from training that prioritized control over aggression, safety over ego. Word of the new program spread quickly, and to the surprise of many, some of the same officers who had once mocked her signed up among the very first participants. Derek and Tyler, in a turn few would have predicted only weeks earlier, became consistent fixtures in Maya's training sessions, arriving early, listening attentively, and applying themselves with an effort that had nothing to do with proving a point to anyone else. Maya taught with patience, correcting technique without condescension, treating every officer in the room, including the two who had once tried to humiliate her, with the same measured respect she extended to everyone else. Over time, the training sessions became less about combat and more about discipline, restraint, and the understanding that true strength rarely needed to announce itself loudly. Officers who once whispered about her past now spoke openly about her guidance, seeking her advice on situations far beyond the training mat. Captain Hayes, observing the transformation from a distance, made a point of publicly commending Maya's professionalism during a department-wide meeting, praising her ability to diffuse conflict without ever resorting to unnecessary force. He noted, in front of the entire assembled unit, that her approach reflected exactly the values the department hoped to instill in every officer under its command. Maya accepted the recognition with the same quiet composure she had carried since her very first day, neither seeking further praise nor deflecting it awkwardly. The room, once filled with officers eager to underestimate her, now listened with the kind of attentive respect earned only through demonstrated character. Months later, the training room that had once hosted a humiliating challenge now served as the regular site of structured, disciplined instruction, filled with officers eager to learn rather than mock. Maya stood at the front of the room one evening, watching her colleagues practice the techniques she had spent years refining long before she ever wore a badge. She reminded them, in a tone free of arrogance, that a black belt did not make anyone stronger than the people around them. It only served as a reminder, she explained. The true strength lay in knowing exactly when fighting was unnecessary at all. The room absorbed her words in respectful silence, officers nodding in quiet agreement, some glancing toward Derek and Tyler, who now stood among the most attentive students in the group. The mats that had once witnessed mockery and humiliation now bore the marks of genuine effort, sweat earned through discipline rather than spite. As the session concluded and officers filed out toward the locker room, the sound of their footsteps and quiet conversation replaced the tense silence that had once defined that space. What remained afterward was not the memory of a fight, but the slow, steady construction of respect, built entirely on competence, patience, and the quiet strength of someone who never needed to prove anything to anyone at all. Derek lingered after most of the others had left, folding a training mat back into place with a care he had never shown for such tasks before. He admitted quietly to Maya that the version of himself who had mocked her on that first day now felt like a stranger, someone he barely recognized in hindsight. He told her that watching her handle both the confrontation in the gym and the crisis at the convenience store had changed the way he thought about strength altogether, no longer equating it with volume or aggression. Maya listened without interrupting, then told him simply that growth mattered more than the mistakes that preceded it, and that his continued effort in training spoke for itself far better than any apology could. Tyler, too, found himself changed in ways he had not anticipated when he first raised his phone to record what he assumed would be an easy joke at someone else's expense. He became one of the more diligent students in Maya's sessions, arriving early to set up equipment and staying late to ask thoughtful questions about technique and philosophy alike. He confided to a fellow officer one evening that he had spent years assuming confidence meant never backing down, but that watching Maya operate had taught him something closer to the opposite. Real confidence, he realized, looked more like restraint, patience, and the willingness to walk away from a fight that did not need to happen at all. Captain Hayes, reflecting on the entire sequence of events during a quiet moment in his office, noted in a private memo that the incident had inadvertently strengthened the unit far more than any standard training exercise could have accomplished. He wrote that true leadership sometimes arrived not through rank or seniority, but through quiet competence demonstrated consistently over time, regardless of how it was initially received. The department, he observed, had nearly lost one of its most capable officers to careless behavior it should have addressed far sooner than it did. He resolved to review onboarding procedures for future transfers, ensuring that no officer's record would again go unnoticed the way Maya's nearly had. Years later, officers who had transferred into the precinct long after the incident still heard some version of the story, passed along informally during slow shifts or quiet moments in the break room. The details shifted slightly with each retelling, though the core of it always remained the same: a woman underestimated by nearly everyone around her, who chose restraint over retaliation at every opportunity available to her. New recruits, hearing the story for the first time, often asked whether it was true that she had trained for over 2 decades before ever wearing a badge, and the answer, delivered by whoever happened to be telling it, was always the same. Every word of it, they would say, had actually happened, right there, in that same training room where recruits still gathered to learn the very lessons Maya had spent her career trying to teach.